Edward VIII, later known as the Duke of Windsor, was King of the United Kingdom and the Dominions of the British Empire and Emperor of India from January 20, 1936 until his abdication in December of the same year. Edward was born during the reign of his great-grandmother Queen Victoria as the eldest child of the Duke and Duchess of York, later King George V and Queen Mary. He was created Prince of Wales on his 16th birthday, 7 weeks after his father succeeded as king. As a young man, Edward served in the British Army during the First World War and undertook several overseas tours on behalf of his father. While Prince of Wales, he engaged in a series of sexual affairs that worried both his father and then British Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin. Upon his father's death in 1936, Edward became the second monarch of the House of Windsor. The new king showed impatience with court protocol, and caused concern among politicians by his apparent disregard for established constitutional conventions. Only months into his reign, a constitutional crisis was caused by his proposal to marry Wallis Simpson, an American who had divorced her first husband and was seeking a divorce from her second. The prime ministers of the United Kingdom and the Dominions opposed the marriage, arguing a divorced woman with 2 living ex-husbands was politically and socially unacceptable as a prospective queen consort. Additionally, such a marriage would have conflicted with Edward's status as titular head of the Church of England, which, at the time, disapproved of remarriage after divorce if a former spouse was still alive. Edward knew the Baldwin government would resign if the marriage went ahead, which could have forced a general election and would have ruined his status as a politically neutral constitutional monarch. When it became apparent he could not marry Simpson and remain on the throne, he abdicated. He was succeeded by his younger brother, George VI. With a reign of 326 days, Edward was one of the shortest reigning British monarchs to date. After his abdication, Edward was created Duke of Windsor. He married Simpson in France on June 3, 1937, after her second divorce became final. Later that year, the couple toured Nazi Germany, which fed rumors that he was a Nazi sympathizer. During the Second World War, Edward was at first stationed with the British military mission to France, but after the fall of France was appointed governor of the Bahamas. After the war, Edward spent the rest of his life in France. He and Wallis remained married until his death in 1972, they had no children. Prelude. Edward had been introduced to Wallis Simpson, an American citizen and wife of British shipping executive Ernest Aldrich Simpson, by Lady Furness on January 10, 1931, when Edward was Prince of Wales. Ernest Simpson was Wallis's second husband. Her first marriage, to U.S. Navy pilot Win Spencer, had ended in divorce in 1927. It is generally accepted that Wallis Simpson and Edward became lovers in 1934, while Lady Furness was visiting relatives in the United States. However, Edward adamantly insisted to his father, King George V, that he was not physically intimate with Simpson and that it was inappropriate to describe her as his mistress. Edward's relationship with Simpson further weakened his poor relationship with his parents. Although King George and Queen Mary met Simpson at Buckingham Palace in 1935, they later refused to receive her. Edward and Simpson were secretly followed by members of the Metropolitan Police Special Branch, who produced reports on the nature of their relationship and their investigations into Wallis Simpson's private life that included the pursuit of vicious gossip and the identification of a secret lover. The prospect of having an American divorcee with a questionable past having such sway over the heir apparent led to anxiety among government and establishment figures. Edward VIII succeeded his father on January 20, 1936, after which Simpson attended more official functions as the king's guest. Despite her name appearing regularly in the court circular, the name of her husband was conspicuously absent. In the summer of that year, the king eschewed the traditional prolonged stay at Balmoral in favor of a holiday with Simpson in the eastern Mediterranean that was widely covered in the American and continental European press, but not by the British press, which maintained a self-imposed silence. Nevertheless, Canadians and expatriate Britons, who had access to the foreign reports, were largely scandalized by the coverage. By October, it was rumored in high society and abroad that Edward intended to marry Simpson as soon as she was free to do so. At the end of that month, the crisis came to a head when she filed for divorce and the American press announced that marriage between her and the king was imminent. The king's private secretary, Alec Hardinge, wrote to him on November 13, warning, "The silence in the British press on the subject of Your Majesty's friendship with Mrs. Simpson is not going to be maintained. Judging by the letters from British subjects living in foreign countries where the press has been outspoken, the effect will be calamitous." Senior British ministers knew that Hardinge had written to the king and may have helped him draft the letter. The king invited Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin to Buckingham Palace the following Monday and informed him that he intended to marry Simpson. Baldwin replied that such a marriage would not be acceptable to the people, stating, "The Queen becomes the Queen of the country. Therefore in the choice of a Queen the voice of the people must be heard." Baldwin's view was shared by the Australian High Commissioner in London, Stanley Bruce, who was also a former Prime Minister of Australia. On the same day that Hardinge wrote to the king, Bruce met Hardinge and then wrote to Baldwin, expressing horror at the idea of a marriage between the king and Simpson. Nevertheless, the British press remained quiet on the subject until Alfred Blunt, Bishop of Bradford, gave a speech to his diocesan conference on December 1, which alluded to the king's need of divine grace. "We hope that he is aware of his need. Some of us wish that he gave more positive signs of his awareness." The press took this for the first public comment by a notable person on the crisis and it became front-page news on December 3. When asked about it later, however, the bishop claimed he had not heard of Simpson at the time he wrote the speech. Acting on the advice of Edward's staff, Simpson left Britain for the south of France 2 days later in an attempt to escape intense press attention. Both she and the king were devastated by the separation. At a tearful departure, the king told her, "I shall never give you up." Opposition to the king and his marriage came from several directions. Edward's desire to modernize the monarchy and make it more accessible, though appreciated by many of the public, was distrusted by the British establishment. Edward upset the aristocracy by treating their traditions and ceremonies with disdain, and many were offended by his abandonment of accepted social norms and mores. Social and moral. Government ministers and the royal family found Wallis Simpson's background and behavior unacceptable for a potential queen. Rumors and innuendo about her circulated in society. The king's mother, Queen Mary, was even told that Simpson might have held some sort of sexual control over Edward, as she had released him from an undefined sexual dysfunction through practices learned in a Chinese brothel. This view was partially shared by Alan Donne, chaplain to the Archbishop of Canterbury, who wrote that he suspected the king is sexually abnormal, which may account for the hold MRSS has over him. Even Edward VIII's official biographer, Philip Ziegler, noted that there must have been some sort of sadomasochistic relationship, relished the contempt and bullying she bestowed on him. Police detectives following Simpson reported back that, while involved with Edward, she was also involved with a married car mechanic and salesman named Guy Trundle. This may well have been passed on to senior figures in the establishment, including members of the royal family. Joseph Kennedy, the American ambassador, described her as a tart, and his wife, Rose, refused to dine with her. Wallis was perceived to be pursuing Edward for his money. His equerry wrote that she would eventually leave him, having secured the cash. The future Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain wrote in his diary that she was an entirely unscrupulous woman who is not in love with the king but is exploiting him for her own purposes. She has already ruined him in money and jewels. Relations between the United Kingdom and the United States were strained during the interwar years, and the majority of Britons were reluctant to accept an American as queen consort. At the time, some members of the British upper class looked down on Americans with disdain and considered them socially inferior. In contrast, the American public was clearly in favor of the marriage, as was most of the American press. Religious and legal. In Edward's lifetime, the Church of England forbade the remarriage of divorced people in church while a former spouse was still living. The monarch was required by law to be in communion with the Church of England, and was its nominal head or supreme governor. In 1935 the Church of England reaffirmed that, in no circumstances can Christian men or women remarry during the lifetime of a wife or a husband. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Gordon Lang, held that the king, as the head of the Church of England, could not marry a divorcee. If Edward married Wallis Simpson, a divorcee who would soon have two living ex-husbands, in a civil ceremony, it would directly conflict with church teaching and his role as the church's ex officio head. Wallis's first divorce was not recognized by the Church of England and, if challenged in the English courts, might not have been recognized under English law. At that time, the Church and English law considered adultery to be the only grounds for divorce. Consequently, under this argument, her second marriage, as well as her marriage to Edward, would be considered bigamous and invalid. The Matrimonial Causes Act 1937, which was passed shortly after Edward and Wallis's marriage, would allow for numerous other divorce justifications at the legal level. Political. When Edward visited depressed mining villages in Wales, his comment that something must be done led to concerns among elected politicians that he would interfere in political matters, traditionally avoided by constitutional monarchs. Ramsay MacDonald, Lord President of the Council, wrote of the King's comments, "These escapades should be limited. They are an invasion into the field of politics and should be watched constitutionally." Although Edward's comments had made him popular in Wales, he became extremely unpopular with the public in Scotland following his refusal to open a new wing of Aberdeen Royal Infirmary, saying he could not do so because he was in mourning for his father. The day after the opening, he was pictured in newspapers on holiday. He had turned down the public event in favour of meeting Simpson. As Prince of Wales, Edward had publicly referred to Labour county councillors as cranks and made speeches counter to government policy. During his reign as king, his refusal to accept the advice of ministers continued. He opposed the imposition of sanctions on Italy after its invasion of Ethiopia, refused to receive the deposed Emperor of Ethiopia, and would not support a strengthening of the League of Nations. Members of the British government became further dismayed by the proposed marriage after being told that Wallis Simpson was an agent of Nazi Germany. The Foreign Office obtained leaked dispatches from the German Reich's ambassador to the United Kingdom, Joachim von Ribbentrop, which revealed his strong view that opposition to the marriage was motivated by the wish to defeat those Germanophile forces which had been working through Mrs. Simpson. It was rumoured that Simpson had access to confidential government papers sent to Edward, which he left unguarded at his Fort Belvedere residence. While Edward was abdicating, the personal protection officers guarding Simpson in exile in France sent reports to Downing Street suggesting that she might flit to Germany. Options considered. As a result of these rumours and arguments, the belief strengthened among the British establishment that Simpson could not become a royal consort. British Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin explicitly advised Edward that the majority of people would be opposed to his marrying Simpson, indicating that if he did, in direct contravention of his minister's advice, the government would resign en masse. The king responded, according to his own account later, "I intend to marry Mrs. Simpson as soon as she is free to marry. If the government opposed the marriage, as the Prime Minister had given me reason to believe it would, then I was prepared to go. Under pressure from the king, and startled at the suggested abdication, Baldwin agreed to take further soundings on 3 options. Edward and Simpson marry and she become queen. Edward and Simpson marry, but she not become queen, instead receiving some courtesy title, or abdication for Edward and any potential heirs he might father, allowing him to make any marital decisions without further constitutional implications. The second option had European precedents, including Edward's own great-grandfather, Duke Alexander of Württemberg, but it had no parallel in British constitutional history. The prime ministers of the 5 dominions were consulted, and the majority agreed that there was no alternative to course. William Lyon Mackenzie King, Joseph Lyons, and J.B.M. Herzog opposed options 1 and 2. Mackenzie King told Edward to do what he believed in his own heart was right, and the Canadian government appealed to the king to put his duty before his feelings for Simpson. Governor-General of Canada Lord Tweedsmuir told Buckingham Palace and Baldwin that Canadians held deep affection for the king, but also that Canadian public opinion would be outraged if Edward married a divorcee. Michael Joseph Savage rejected option 1 and thought that option 2 might be possible, if some solution along these lines were found to be practicable, but would be guided by the decision of the home government. In communications with the British government, Eamon de Valera remarked that as a Roman Catholic country, the Irish Free State did not recognise divorce. He supposed that if the British people would not accept Wallace Simpson, then abdication was the only possible solution. On November 24, Baldwin consulted the 3 leading opposition politicians in Britain, leader of the opposition Clement Attlee, Liberal leader Sir Archibald Sinclair, and Winston Churchill. Sinclair and Attlee agreed that options 1 and 2 were unacceptable, and Churchill pledged to support the government. Churchill did not support the government, however. In July, he had advised the King's legal counsel, Walter Monckton, against the divorce, but his advice was ignored. As soon as the affair became public knowledge, Churchill started to pressure Baldwin and the King to delay any decisions until Parliament and the people had been consulted. In a private letter to Geoffrey Dawson, the editor of the Times newspaper, Churchill suggested that a delay would be beneficial because, given time, the King might fall out of love with Simpson. Baldwin rejected the request for delay, presumably because he preferred to resolve the crisis quickly. Supporters of the King alleged a conspiracy between Baldwin, Geoffrey Dawson, and Cosmo Gordon Lang, the Archbishop of Canterbury. The royal physician Bertrand Dawson was possibly involved in a plan to force the Prime Minister to retire on the grounds of heart disease, but he eventually accepted, on the evidence of an early electrocardiograph, that Baldwin's heart was sound. Political support for the King was scattered and comprised politicians alienated from the mainstream parties such as Churchill, Oswald Mosley, and the Communist Party of Great Britain. Former Prime Minister David Lloyd George also supported the King despite disliking Simpson. He was, however, unable to take any active role in the crisis because he was on holiday in Jamaica with his mistress Frances Stevenson. In early December, rumours circulated that the King's supporters would join in a King's Party, led by Churchill. However, there was no concerted effort to form an organised movement, and Churchill had no intention of leading one. Nevertheless, the rumours damaged the King and Churchill severely, as members of Parliament were horrified at the idea of the King interfering in politics. The letters and diaries of working-class people and ex-servicemen generally demonstrate support for the King, while those from the middle and upper classes tend to express indignation and distaste. The Times, the Morning Post, Daily Herald, and newspapers owned by Lord Kemsley, such as the Daily Telegraph, opposed the marriage. On the other hand, the Daily Express and the Daily Mail, owned by Lord Beaverbrook and Lord Rothermere, respectively, appeared to support a morganatic marriage. The King estimated that the newspapers in favour had a circulation of 12.5 million, and those against had 8.5 million. On December 3, Edward had a tense meeting with Baldwin. Backed by Churchill and Beaverbrook, Edward proposed to broadcast a speech via the BBC. The proposed text invoked the ancient custom for a king to address his public utterances to his people. Edward proposed to remind his listeners, "I am still the same man whose motto was Ich diene, I serve." In the proposed speech, Edward indicated his desire to remain on the throne or to be recalled to it if forced to abdicate, while marrying Simpson morganatically. In one section, Edward proposed to say, "Neither Mrs. Simpson nor I have ever sought to insist that she should be queen. All we desired was that our married happiness should carry with it a proper title and dignity for her, befitting my wife. Now that I have at last been able to take you into my confidence, I feel it is best to go away for a while, so that you may reflect calmly and quietly, but without undue delay, on what I have said." Baldwin blocked the speech, saying that it would shock many people and would be a grave breach of constitutional principles. By modern convention, the sovereign could only act with the advice and counsel of ministers. In seeking the people's support against the government, Edward was opting to oppose binding ministerial advice and instead act as a private individual. Edward's British ministers felt that, in proposing the speech, Edward had revealed his disdainful attitude towards constitutional conventions and threatened the political neutrality of the Crown. Cabinet Office files released in 2013 show that on or before December 5, 1936, the Home Secretary, Sir John Simon, had ordered the General Post Office to intercept telephone communications between Fort Belvedere and Buckingham Palace on the one hand and the continent of Europe on the other. On 5 December, having in effect been told that he could not keep the throne and marry Simpson, and having had his request to broadcast to the Empire to explain his side of the story blocked on constitutional grounds, Edward chose the third option. Legal maneuvers. Following Simpson's divorce hearing on October 27, 1936, her solicitor, John Theodore Goddard, became concerned that there would be a patriotic citizens' intervention, and that such an intervention would be successful. The courts could not grant a collaborative divorce, and so the case was being handled as if it were an undefended at-fault divorce brought against Ernest Simpson, with Wallace Simpson as the innocent, injured party. The divorce action would fail if the citizens' intervention showed that the Simpsons had colluded by, for example, conniving in or staging the appearance of his adultery so that she could marry someone else. On Monday, December 7, 1936, the king heard that Goddard planned to fly to the south of France to see Wallace Simpson. The king summoned him and expressly forbade him to make the journey, fearing that the visit might put doubts in Simpson's mind. Goddard went straight to Downing Street to see Baldwin, as a result of which he was provided with an aeroplane to take him directly to Caen. Upon his arrival, Goddard warned his client that a citizen's intervention, should it arise, was likely to succeed. It was, according to Goddard, his duty to advise her to withdraw her divorce petition. Simpson refused, but they both telephoned the king to inform him that she was willing to give him up so that he could remain king. It was, however, too late. The king had already made up his mind to go, even if he could not marry Simpson. Indeed, as the belief that the abdication was inevitable gathered strength, Goddard stated that, client was ready to do anything to ease the situation, but the other end of the wicket was determined. Goddard had a weak heart and had never flown before, so he asked his doctor, William Kirkwood, to accompany him on the trip. As Kirkwood was a resident at a maternity hospital, his presence led to false speculation that Simpson was pregnant, and even that she was having an abortion. The press excitedly reported that the solicitor had flown to Simpson accompanied by a gynecologist and an anesthetist. Abdication. At Fort Belvedere, on December 10, Edward signed his written abdication notices, witnessed by his three younger brothers, Prince Albert, Duke of York, Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, and Prince George, Duke of Kent. The following day, it was given effect by Act of Parliament, His Majesty's Declaration of Abdication Act 1936. Under changes introduced in 1931 by the Statute of Westminster, a single crown for the entire empire had been replaced by multiple crowns, one for each dominion, worn by a single monarch in an organisation then known as the British Commonwealth. Though the British government, hoping for expediency and to avoid embarrassment, wished the dominions to accept the actions of the home government, the dominions held that Edward's abdication required the consent of each Commonwealth state. Under the Statute of Westminster, the act passed by the UK Parliament could become law in other dominions at their request. This was duly given by the Parliament of Australia, which was at the time in session, and by the governments of Canada, South Africa, and New Zealand, whose parliaments were in recess. The government of the Irish Free State, taking the opportunity presented by the crisis and in a major step towards its eventual transition to a republic, passed an amendment to its constitution on December 11 to remove references to the Crown and abolish the office of Governor-General of the Irish Free State. The King's abdication was recognised a day later in the External Relations Act. In South Africa, His Majesty King Edward VIII's Abdication Act 1937 declared that the abdication took effect there on December 10. Canada passed the Succession to the Throne Act 1937 to symbolically confirm the abdication. Edward's supporters felt that he had been hounded from the throne by that arch-humbug Baldwin, but many members of the establishment were relieved by Edward's departure. Mackenzie King wrote in his diary on December 8, 1936 that Edward's sense of right or wrong has been largely obliterated by the jazz of life he has led for years and, upon receiving news of Edward's final decision to abdicate, if that is the kind of man he is, it is better he should not be longer on the throne. Edward's own assistant private secretary, Alan Lascelles, had told Baldwin as early as 1927, "I can't help thinking that the best thing that could happen to him, and to the country, would be for him to break his neck." On December 11, 1936, Edward made a BBC radio broadcast from Windsor Castle. Having abdicated, he was introduced by Sir John Reith as His Royal Highness Prince Edward. The official address had been polished by Churchill and was moderate in tone, speaking about Edward's inability to do his job as I would have wished without the support of the woman I love. Edward's reign had lasted 327 days, the shortest of any British monarch since the disputed reign of Lady Jane Grey over 380 years earlier. The day following the broadcast he left Britain for Austria.